Hello, this is Brian. Today is Saturday, July 20th, 2019, and this is another episode of Spotlight on Trees. Today I want to highlight a very common pine in Southern California. And if you've been into our mountains, especially at the lower and mid elevations, and saw big cones like these, you have witnessed the evidence of the Coulter Pine, Pinus coulteri. This tree is a very common lower to mid elevation pine, sometimes found below 3,000 feet and sometimes seen at over 7,000 feet. It is generally, size-wise, a smaller to medium-sized pine, usually up to maybe about 75 feet tall. Sometimes they grow very stunted in very dry areas, and they may not get up to more than 30-40 feet. And then I've seen some that are over 100 feet tall. Now, one thing about the Coulter Pine, it's not as widely distributed as its close relatives, the Ponderosae pine, the Jeffrey pine, and the gray pine. The Coulter pine is found along the coast ranges from, I believe, about Mount Diablo behind the East Bay to Baja California. It does not grow in the Sierra Nevada natively. It is not native to the Sierra Nevada, and it's very common here in Southern California. It has the largest cones and heaviest cones of any pine. And I'm not talking about conifers. That, I believe, goes to the Bunya Bunya, Auraucaria bidwillii of Australia. I believe that has the largest cones of any conifer, but that's in the Auraucariaceae, the Auraucaria family, related to the Norfolk Island pine, sometimes planted in Southern California. Coulter pine cones, they can get up to maybe 10, maybe close to 10 inches, close to a foot. Very heavy, with very sharp claws at the end of their scales. So this is one of those trees you do not want to camp under or hang out under too long in case the cones fall. And cones fall all the time. Look at all the cones on the ground here underneath this Coulter pine. This is a pretty typical size specimen here. I would say this one's probably maybe about 45, 50 feet tall. And it has a very stout, kind of a broadly conical crown. And as you might barely be able to see on the camera, but as they get older, their leaders tend to split off. Now, they may retain a roughly conical crown even with the multiple leaders, because the leaders will often kind of fork off close to each other, but they can get some pretty wide open, almost irregular shapes too with age. Now, just like any other pine, like Ponderosae, Jeffrey, they start out narrow, kind of like this Jeffrey pine. They kind of start out like that when they're a lot younger, but then they tend to broaden out a little bit more than the typical Jeffrey pine. See, this is a Jeffrey pine, Pinus coulteri, and that right there is a Coulter pine. You can tell that one's a little bit wider. The lower branches come out a lot more on the Coulter pine, as evidenced here. The lower branches come pretty far from the trunk. Now, according to James Eckenwalder's Conifers of the World, this is in the yellow pine group, the Ponderosae group, according to that. Its closest relative, I believe, is gray pine, Pinus sabiniana. Torrey pine, Pinus torreyiana, subspecies torreyana and subspecies insularis. And Jeffrey pine is another very close relative. And I have seen the hybrids between Jeffreys and Coulters on a couple of occasions. I've seen them Seen them in the San Bernardinos, and I believe there's a really tall one on Mount Palomar. I believe that's a hybrid Coulter and Jeffrey. Now, Coulter pines don't typically form a very dense, tightly packed forest. Their stands are usually pretty open and very scattered, and typically in chaparral, especially at the lower elevations. However, higher up, right now we are at about an elevation of maybe just a sliver under 6,200 feet. I'm on the Mount Hillyer Trail in the Angeles National Forest. This is Mount Hillyer. The Chilao area goes over there. Angeles Crest Highway goes over that way. And Mount Hillyer reaches its highest point about 6,200 feet in this general vicinity, and I'm near the highest point right now. But Coulter pines can grow up well into the yellow pine belt. And why am I separating Coulter pines from the other yellow pines? Well, typically, the yellow pine belt is typically reserved for Jeffrey and Ponderosa pines, and then mixed in with the white pines like the sugar pine, and then mixed in with the white fir, incense cedar here in Southern California. Coulter pines do reach up into it. Like I said, I've seen them at over 7,000 feet in elevation. I've seen them mixing in with the Jeffreys, Ponderosas, big cone Douglas firs, sugar pines. Sometimes like about 6,000 feet seems to be the melding of a lot of these biotic zones. So you get a good mixture of different trees, because one zone is transitioning into the other. So like around the 5,000 to 6,000 feet is a very good transitional zone to see Coulter pines in a very heterogeneous forest. But a lot of times they do grow alone as the lone conifer in chaparral or near big cone Douglas firs, and a lot of times upslope from big cone Douglas firs, because big cone Douglas firs tend to like more of the steep ravines and canyons, whereas the Coulter pines tend to like the ridge tops and the upper slopes of the canyons. So, like a lot of the yellow pine group trees, the Coulter pine has its needles in bundles of 3. However, the Coulter pine needles tend to be a bit longer. Not always, but they tend to be a bit longer. This is a perfect example of a typical branch of a Coulter pine with long, bluish, grayish, greenish needles. Typically longer than the needles on Jeffrey pine, but not always the case. Coulter pines that grow in very, very dry areas that are stunted often have shorter needles as well. Like I said, the biggest telltale sign of a Coulter pine, the cones. Because when they're very young and not bearing cones yet, they can be somewhat difficult to tell apart from Ponderosa and Jeffrey pines when they're very young. So a lot of times the cone is the clue. Big egg-shaped cones with sharp prickles at the end of their scales, very heavy and long. The only other pine cone that comes close to the heaviness is the gray pine, which has similar cones but smaller. Gray pine cones are a bit smaller, maybe closer to the size of that, but that's a Coulter cone. And they're not quite as tan colored as the Coulter pine. But here you have it. Beautiful Coulter pine, Pinus coulteri. It's a tree I have seen on many hikes. Always look forward to seeing it. Beautiful tree, and the bark usually does not break out into really wide plates like the Ponderosas and to a lesser extent the Jeffreys. They can plate out a little bit, but see, they tend to be a little bit more on the roughly furrowed side. But when they get bigger, sometimes they can develop some plating, but it's not as prevalent as on Jeffrey pine and Ponderosa. And they don't really have that vanilla smell that Jeffrey pines have. So here you have it. the beautiful Coulter Pine, Pinus coulteri. Beautiful tree. And I will see you on the next episode of Spotlight on Trees. I really appreciate you watching. I hope you found this interesting and helpful in identifying native trees here in Southern California. See you on the next episode.